Hello. So today we are going to talk about necropolitics. And it will follow from the previous lecture about Michel Foucault. So I will make reference to this week's readings by Mbembe about necropolitics and the politics of life and death in relation to sovereignty. So many of the authors draw upon each other. So this reading about necropolitics follows from Foucault's reading about the panopticon and biopolitics. And the first lecture we began with was Homo Sacer by Giorgio Agamben. The political point that I think that is important to consider when reading the article lies in the relationship between the sovereign who has the power to kill, and particularly the power to kill because of colonial occupation or ethnic cleansing, and the power of the public to engage in war. And the essay actually ends with the discussion about suicide, bombing, and war. So if one is in a context where they can be ruled over to the point that they would die or be enslaved, then do they have the right to rebel? And in many ways, the answer is no in the modern world, because one consents to be under state authority. And so what interests the author is when people feel as though their only kind of freedom from the state might lie in self-harm. And that comes at the end of the article. And it's kind of a really disturbing end to the article. But the previous passages also deal with colonial occupation and race. So biopolitics is not just then the capacity to make certain groups of people live. It is also the capacity to make certain groups of people die. And this essay also relates to Jesper Puar's very well-cited book, Terrorist Assemblages, Homo Nationalism in Queer Times. And Puar argues that the construction of certain populations of people who are included in the life of the nation under the guise of, say, sexual freedom or consumer freedom corresponds with the vilification of those who are associated with the death of the nation, namely religious minorities like Muslims and Sikhs, who were subject to a great deal of policing during the global war on terror. And I guess I would argue that this kind of politics of life and death in this time period could be thought of in relation to all of the mass protests that followed the murder or death, as some might choose to term it, murder or death of George Floyd, who was killed in the United States of America. And so the politics of who can be killed by state power also corresponds with the politics of protest, sovereignty, but also violence. I guess What one might ask as a sociologist, and my PhD is in sociology, is whether the kind of extrajudicial killing of minorities, and particularly what one might term post-colonial subjects whose genealogy is connected to histories of the transatlantic slave trade and the colonization of lower income countries. I guess if these populations of people are subject to impoverishment, poor housing conditions, and policing, then will there be a reclamation of sovereignty in the bodies of those who commit crimes against the state in the form of, say, gangs or other acts of violence? Suicide bomber, I think, is just one example of this kind of violence against authority and against specific forms of authority, but also against the kind of world. And in this time period, I think there are also other examples that one could think of. And we discussed the involuntary celibate movement in previous lectures as well. And so throughout the lecture, I'll draw on the article and the other readings to discuss the politics of life and death, and the relationship between life, death, and sovereignty.
I chose Wix for my business because of its massive scope for functionality and freedom.
Hey everyone, back again. I know it's been a while since I've done one of these keyword things, but better late than never. If you're watching this, you may have noticed that my bookshelf is empty, and that's because I'm in the process of moving and the books had to go, except for a few, and it's a long story, but I won't get into that now. And just because I know a bunch of people will ask, I'm moving to Montreal. Hopefully we'll be there full time in the new year, maybe a little before, but in any case, we're going to talk about necropolitics today. So I've done a full episode on Achille Mbembe's essay dealing specifically with this topic. But today I just want to give more of a highlights as to what's going on with that term, why he's using it, and what he's using it to respond to, specifically the work of Foucault. Now, in that text, he makes a lot of reference to other thinkers, including Bataille and Heidegger, Hegel, and a number of others. And I'm not going to get into them so much here, more just Foucault and what Mbembe is doing in response to Foucault. Now, before jumping into it, if you want to follow me anywhere other than here, you can find me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy or on Twitter at David Guignot. If you're new here, welcome. I'm David. I try to explain philosophical texts and ideas in a way that makes them accessible to you. So if you're new, like, share, subscribe, tell your friends. Who knows, they might get a kick out of it, or they might not, but you could try. If you haven't already, like, share, subscribe. If you want to help me out, do all those things. You can help me out monetarily via Patreon or PayPal. If you found this on YouTube, you'll be able to find it in podcast form pretty much anywhere where you get podcasts, so there shouldn't be any ads. Or if you found this in podcast form, you'll be able to find it on YouTube. And in this case, you'll see a video with a barren bookcase behind me. But in any case, let's jump into it because I don't want to waste any more of your time with that stuff. So, necropolitics. To put it simply, this is Mbembe's way to respond to Foucault's notion of biopolitics. Now, I've done a whole episode on that term alone, which you can go check out if you want. The short form of it is that, as Foucault describes it, is that there was a transformation in the way that power was organized between what he calls sovereign power to disciplinary power and then biopower. Now, to put this transformation pretty simply, what he says is that there was once a time, and we're probably all familiar with this idea, where a king or queen, some kind of royalty, held control over a state, and they got to decide who lived and who died. And they often exerted their power and demonstrated their power by putting people to death. So here we might think of executions happening in the town square or anything like that, sending armies to go and kill many people and so on. Now, Foucault says that at one point, there was a transformation in this logic of control and power, where it became not necessarily about the capacity to put someone to death, but also how can a system organize itself by commanding life, by actually proliferating life, by putting life under more stringent control, not necessarily to end it, but to control it. And through this control could come a kind of proliferation. So we actually see a kind of expansion of life where the focus is on controlling populations and bodies over putting them to death. Because that is messy. Exerting such overt power over a group of people, over a population, through the act of killing, makes that person, that is the person calling the shots, too much of a target. That's just a very fantastic way to make the people turn against you and have some kind of a mutiny. Now, in this case, because power works in such a way that it almost appears to be benevolent, and this assumes the form of control over populations, like over, for example, reproductive rights, the formation of various logics pertaining to race and racism, and these play themselves out in many institutions from schools to hospitals, clinics, and so on. They appear to be quite benevolent. Yet, and Foucault does this really well, he demonstrates that they aren't nearly so benevolent, nor are they marvels in terms of scientific development and rigor in the way that they claim to be. Now, Ashim Mbembe is dissatisfied with this formulation because he's looking around, he looks at history, and he says, there seems to be a lot of death still going on. There seems to be lots of people still being put to death, lots of people still suffering physically. Their bodies aren't proliferating, they aren't being controlled through these institutions. There are bombs dropping on people, there are governments exerting unimaginable control and power over certain bodies. So he says, well, it seems as though biopolitics, biopower is only half the story. We also need a way to account for the death that is still ensuing. And this is what he calls necropolitics or necropower. Now, this exerts itself in a very different way than it did under a sovereign, as Foucault described it, the person that would call the shots and got to decide who would live and who would die. Necropolitics for Mbembe exerts itself with a kind of statistical perfection. That is, it deploys tactics and strategies to put an end to certain populations, to certain bodies with minimal resistance. So here we aren't thinking of dueling armies. We're thinking of populations being put to death at the behest of the state that has deemed these bodies, has deemed these people to be less than living, to borrow one of Agamben's terms, somebody that Mbembe is indebted to reduce them to the state of bare life, to make it so that they have nothing to offer other than the fact that they are bodies. And when people are reduced to just bare life, then their life doesn't have any extra meaning and they can then be expendable. They can be reduced to nothing. Mbembe says that this type of necropower has a very long history, and this act of reducing populations to this kind of bare life, to this life that is not worth living, it is therefore expendable. And it goes all the way back to colonial times and the long legacy of slavery that much of Europe, the United States, Canada, and many other parts of the globe are built upon. These were acts that reduced certain populations, notably Black and Indigenous people, to just bare life. They could just then be seen as useful tools for someone else's livelihood, for someone else's benefit. Now, this was an example of necropower because it reduced these people to a kind of living death, to a point that all they had was what they could give to somebody else. They had no life for themselves. Now, we see this playing out for him in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where Palestinian people are repeatedly reduced to this kind of bare life. They are reduced to the point of being on constant alertness for any kind of imminent attack while having very little power, very little opportunity to actually defend themselves. They are very much at the behest of neighboring Israel and other global state powers that have a vested interest in that territory. And so he uses that example to demonstrate that necropower is very much on full display. It is not just about expanding life, controlling populations. It is about reducing people to nothing so that they can then be more easily killed. And of course, the same logics could have been seen and were seen in the Holocaust, where Jewish people were reduced to this level of nothingness that could make them that much more easily to be killed. They were reduced to a kind of statistic, just numbers on sheets that stripped them of their humanity, making it easier for someone to conduct the train to Auschwitz or to Dachau or to any one of the other concentration camps, or for somebody else to check the people in there, to keep logs of them. When you reduce people to that level of being, if we can call it being at all, then they become much more susceptible. They become vulnerable to these kinds of attacks, these wide-scale necropolitical attacks against them. Now, these are all examples of what he calls death worlds, entire sites, places, spaces reduced to a status of death world where only death can ensue, be it an actual physical death or the reduction of a body to bare life, to having no purpose other than just living off of the absolute bare minimum, to a kind of living death. In that space that is in this death world, people are reduced to this reprehensible status, and they have no way to actually get out of it in the face of these global superpowers that make it so, that put them in these positions alongside all of the many institutions that justify people being reduced to this status of bare life. And that more or less covers what Mbembe is doing here in his response to Foucault. If you want more of it, go check out that other video I did where I explain in much more depth the entire essay. But if you like what I did here, like, share, subscribe, tell your friends, and yeah, catch you next time. Take care.
So Mbembe uses other examples of this reduction of life to countenance and categorization, which can then lead to control and expulsion. So he utilizes examples of slavery, apartheid. He also discusses colonization, and he specifically makes reference to the occupation of Palestine and the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and also the suicide bomber, and he discusses the Holocaust as well. So these are all forms of necro power over the body. So, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, biopolitics refers to the ways that the state intervenes into all forms of human life to support life, and the techniques that are used to valorize life or to actively involve oneself in nation building by intervening in the population's health are called biopower. And these are techniques of governance and techniques of affirming life, like warnings on food packages or nutritional content warnings, the healthcare system, vaccines. And so what Mbembe is interested in, though, is necropolitics and how the state also engages in practices that are about killing of certain populations of people. And then drawing on Foucault, he also discusses necropower as techniques of colonization, apartheid, slavery, ethnic cleansing, civil war, all ways of killing. I would argue, drawing on some of the previous course content and the future articles, which we will end with, that reports regarding missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada offer evidence of this kind of gendered necropolitics and the ways that the killing specifically of Indigenous women, Black women, women of color, Muslim women, is really about not only killing, but preventing future populations from being born. So Mbembe states that this essay assumes that the ultimate expression of sovereignty resides to a large degree in the power and the capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. And there have been really high-profile cases of the murder of Indigenous women, like the case of Cindy Gladue. And in the trials, Cindy Gladue was referred to as a native prostitute over and over again. The term Cree was not used. Even the term woman or the term person was not used. Bradley Barton, who was accused of murdering Cindy Gladue, was not referred to as a white man or as a John or a pimp. So this kind of categorization is also about the politics of killing and of who one not only lets die, but perhaps actively engages in killing in an effort to build a certain type of nation state. So one could summarize in the above terms what Michel Foucault meant by a biopower, that domain of life which power has taken control of. But under what practical conditions is the right to kill, to allow to live, or to expose to death exercised? Who is the subject of this right? What does the implementation of such a right tell us about the person who is thus put to death, and about the relation of enmity that sets that person against his or her murderer? Is the notion of biopower sufficient to account for the contemporary ways in which the political, under the guise of war, of resistance, or of the fight against terror, makes the murder of the enemy its primary and absolute objective? War, after all, is as much a means of achieving sovereignty as a way of exercising the right to kill. Imagining politics as a form of war, we must ask, what place is given to life, death, and the human body, in particular the wounded or slayed body? How are they inscribed in the order of power? So, what the author asks again and again throughout the essay is, what are the conditions under which one can kill? And how can the state decide who to kill and under what conditions? And it's a really interesting debate to think about now because of abolition movements against policing and against the prison industrial complex, particularly after the extrajudicial killing or the police killing, the kind of, I guess I would argue, unlawful killing of young, unarmed Black people in the United States of America. And there have been similar acts of murder, or what I would term murder in Canada, like the killing of Andrew Loku, who was a refugee who was killed by the police. And who has the right to kill, and at what point the state can actually intervene in your life and take your life is, I think, a really central political question of our time. And the author draws on these examples from the Nazis to look at times in history when the killing of civilians under the guise of, I guess, protection or policing or um, criminal justice was actually about removing populations of people who were an economic threat to the religious and racial majority. And obviously, the state's right to remove and to kill is really terrifying if we consider the history of the Nazis and the Holocaust. As is well known, the concept of the state of exception has been often discussed in relation to Nazism, totalitarianism, and the concentration and extermination camps. The death camps in particular have been interpreted variously as a central metaphor for sovereign and destructive violence and as the ultimate sign of the absolute power of the negative. Says Hannah Arendt, there are no parallels to the life in the concentration camps. Its horror can never be fully embraced by the imagination for the very reason that it stands outside of life and death. Because its inhabitants are divested of political status and reduced to bare life, the camp is, for Giorgio Agamben, the place in which the most absolute conditio inhumana ever to appear on earth was realized. According to Agamben, it acquires a permanent spatial arrangement that remains continually outside the normal state of law. The aim of this essay is not to debate the singularity of the extermination of the Jews, or to hold it up by way of example. I start from the idea that modernity was at the origin of multiple concepts of sovereignty, and therefore of the political. Disregarding this multiplicity, late modern political criticism has unfortunately privileged normative theories of democracy and has made the concept of reason one of the most important elements of both the project of modernity and the topos of sovereignty. From this perspective, the ultimate expression of sovereignty is the production of general norms by a body made up of free and equal men and women. These men and women are posited as full subjects capable of self-understanding, self-consciousness, and self-representation. Politics, therefore, is defined as twofold: a project of autonomy and the achieving of agreement among a collectivity through communication and recognition. This, we are told, is what differentiates it from war. So a critique that is offered of modern forms of governance and sovereignty is this right to kill. That if we accept that we are subject to the authority of the state and the police, then what are the terms under which we can be detained and killed or removed? And the example of the Holocaust is kind of one of the most terrifying examples of what happens when people are subject to state authority and must trust police and state authority. So sovereignty itself is something that Mbembe discusses in the essay. The romance of sovereignty in this case rests on the belief that the subject is the master and the controlling author of his or her meaning. Sovereignty is therefore defined as a twofold process of self-institution and self-limitation, fixing one's own limits for oneself, The exercise of sovereignty, in turn, consists in society's capacity for self-creation through recourse to institutions inspired by specific social and imaginary significations. And it is in this shift between self-sovereignty and the sovereignty of institutions that one can pose philosophical questions and political questions about who has the right to control social institutions. So, if the exercise of sovereignty in turn consists in society's capacity for self creation through recourse to institutions inspired by social and imaginary significations, who determines what the social and imaginary significations are? Um, if we are all kind of self instituting and self-limiting people, then when we enter into institutions of power, should these institutions of power be uniform in their beliefs and ideas? And some of the most pressing debates about this kind of universalization of institutional norms that we could have today, or that are intelligible in law, are about gender and sexuality and the family. So if institutions are supposed to uphold the family, then can institutions change, and should they? And the answer is obviously yes. So Bill C-16 added gender identity and gender expression into the Human Rights Act and the Human Rights Code so that one can self-identify as transgender in this time period. And so one's own self institution and self limitation in terms of gender identity and gender expression cannot be tampered with institutionally. But the question is, can this be true of everyone? Are institutions still going to uphold a certain set of norms? And the answer is obviously yes. And politics is really, I think, about this kind of constant debate about whose social and imaginary significations define social institutions. So if you were to think about it in relation to, say, healthcare, what is going to be paid for by taxpayers and what is going to be paid for by oneself are contestations over how much we need to kind of self-limit and institute ourselves, and how much we are recipients of certain permissions or privileges from the social welfare state. So the reason that someone would, I think about institutions and collective institutions is because of the social welfare state model. And many scholars have argued that in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a massive dissolution of a social welfare state, which would provide people with free tuition or subsidized housing. And we then enter a time of neoliberalism. So being subject to sovereignty means that you are not just under kind of authoritarian power. I mean, wanting to belong as a citizen to a modern state is not just about policing. It is about being given certain privileges of healthcare, of social welfare, of child benefits. So my concern, writes Mbembe, is those figures of sovereignty whose central project is not the struggle for autonomy, but the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies and populations. Such figures of sovereignty are far from a piece of prodigious sanity or an expression of a rupee, or an expression of a rupture, between the impulses and interests of the body and those of the mind. Indeed, they, like the death camps, are what constitute the nomos of the political space in which we still live. Furthermore, contemporary experiences of human destruction suggest that it is possible to develop a reading of politics, sovereignty, and the subject different from the one we inherited from the philosophical discourse of modernity. Instead of considering reason as the truth of the subject, we can look to other foundational categories that are less abstract and more tactile, such as life and death. In other words, the human being truly becomes a subject that is separated from the animal in the struggle and the work through which he or she confronts death, understood as the violence of negativity. It is through this confrontation with death that he or she is cast into the incessant movement of history. Becoming subject, therefore, supposes upholding the work of death. To uphold the work of death is precisely how Hegel defines the life of the spirit. The life of the spirit, he says, is not that life which is frightened of death and spares itself destruction, but that life which assumes death and lives with it. Spirit attains its truth only by finding itself in absolute dismemberment. This struggle, confrontation of death for Hegel is really about life. So we know that we are kind of alive and individuated and humans because of this struggle against death. So to uphold the work of death is precisely how Hegel defines the life of the spirit. The life of the spirit, he says, is not that life which is frightened of death and spares itself destruction, but that life which assumes death and lives with it. Spirit attains its truth only by finding itself in absolute dismemberment. So the article is somewhat dense. It's quite a heavy, it's quite a theoretical article, but it's a very well-cited article about necropolitics. And Mbembe draws on Bataille and Hegel. First, he interprets death and sovereignty as the paroxysm of exchange and superabundance, or to use his own terminology, excess. For Bataille, life is defectively only when death has taken hostage. Life itself exists only in bursts and in exchange with death. He argues that death is the putrefaction of life, the stench that is at once the source and the repulsive conditions of life. Therefore, although it destroys what was to be, obliterates what was supposed to continue being, and reduces it to nothing, the individual who takes it, death does not come down to the pure annihilation of being. Second, Bataille firmly anchors death in the realm of absolute expenditure, the other characteristic of sovereignty, whereas Hegel tries to keep death within the economy of absolute knowledge and meaning. Life beyond utility, says Bataille, is the domain of sovereignty. This being the case, death is therefore the point at which destruction, suppression, and sacrifice constitute so irreversible and radical an expenditure without reserve, that they can no longer be determined as negativity. Death is therefore the very principle of excess, an anti-economy. Hence the metaphor of luxury and the luxurious character of death. Third, Bataille establishes a correlation among death, sovereignty, and sexuality. Sexuality is inextricably linked to violence and to the dissolution of the boundaries of the body and self by way of orgiastic and excremental impulses. As such, sexuality concerns two major forms of polarized human impulses, excretion and appropriation, as well as the regime of the taboo surrounding them. The truth of sex and its deadly attributes reside in the experiences of loss of the boundaries separating reality events and fantasized objects.
Sticky notes are hard to keep track.
This is another clip about Shili Memembe and Michel Foucault, and the relationship between these two philosophers.
Notes apps don't keep you on schedule. Calendars don't adapt to your changing day.
Hey everyone, back again. Today I want to talk about the distinction between Achille Mbembe's idea of necropolitics and Michel Foucault's notion of biopolitics. But before jumping into it, hi, I'm David. I explain philosophical concepts and ideas and ways to make them accessible to you. Accessible to you. So if you're new here, you can subscribe and see videos I release every week, sometimes twice a week, like this week. If you want to follow me anywhere else, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, links for all such things in the description. If you like what I do, you can like, share, subscribe. If you want to help me out, you can do it monetarily via Patreon or PayPal. No pressure to do that. If you found this on YouTube, you're going to be able to find it as just a podcast on pretty much any platform with under all the same names and stuff. If you found this as a podcast, you're going to be able to find the video on YouTube, which is cool, of course. So without further ado, let's get into the distinction between Foucault's notion of biopolitics and Mbembe's notion of necropolitics. Now I'm going to start with Foucault because chronologically it's first, and Mbembe is responding to Foucault, so that makes sense. So Foucault's notion of biopolitics, super interesting, fascinating term, and one that he gets lots of credit for, even though he didn't write about it a whole lot. It's actually super interesting to me. Even in his text, The Birth of Biopolitics, one of his lectures at the Collège de France, he barely writes about it at all. Instead, he just writes about its history or like what led up to it. Now, what actually did lead up to it? Foucault tells us that biopolitics emerges at a point in which state power transforms into individual power, where we see instead of people submitting to states and royalty and religion and everything like that, they begin to embrace individualism or liberalism, which would eventually culminate into neoliberalism, which on its face appears to be a radical departure from previous forms of control that people experience under states, under royal dynasties, under religious control. And instead, they were opened up only to their own desire, their own will to provide for themselves. And of course, this dovetails with various economic developments, really the formation of capitalism in the 18th and 19th centuries that allowed people to ostensibly live their lives the way that they wanted to, free from restraint, free from control. However, it's not actually quite so neat as that, nor is it quite as liberating as that narrative makes us think. Instead, Foucault identifies that the types of control that were found under these previous forms of governance, like states or royalty or whatever, transformed. They did not disappear. Instead, they found their ways into our very sense of ourselves, to the point that they became indistinguishable from the creation of ourselves as individuals, as atomized, self-sufficient identities floating in the world, which might seem totally strange. I mean, you think of yourself as a free individual living on the rugged land, free to do whatever you'd like, away from control. You can go to school if you want to, you can participate in government if you want to, you can vote if you want to. But underlying all of these supposed choices are rigid constraints that go unnoticed. Some of these might include your adherence to various ideas about diet, maybe, or your adherence to various ideas about what it means to be a proper upstanding citizen, or what it means to have a relationship with your family, your friends, what it means to actually have a relationship with knowledge, with the acquisition of knowledge. So Foucault says that at this time in the 18th and 19th centuries, when we see this idea of liberalism emerge, also emerged various new kinds of control and understandings that were applied against human conduct. So more rigorous understandings of what it meant to actually be a human emerged. It didn't necessarily reflect a neutral observation and scientific deduction about what it means to be human, but actually was an imposition of what it means to be human, how to be a proper ethical human, how to exist in the world properly, what rules can be broken, whose interests can you struggle for and whose can you not struggle for. So we saw the emergence then of various institutions like prisons that began to lock people away in mass numbers, where we saw mental asylums emerge that created and really riffed off the idea of an emerging normality, normalcy, normal conduct. And if you deviated from that norm, you would be sent to prison. So Foucault identifies that even though there is this dream of liberalism, people are still being controlled. Now, one of the overarching terms to really understand this type of control is biopolitics, which is a type of control that focuses on people's livelihoods, people's lives, extending lives, and manipulating those lives as a means of control, instead of exerting force to cause physical pain against people, to put people to death, which still goes on. But in any case, we'll get to that, to put people to death, to scare people, which Foucault says is not a very efficient form of control. Because if you have like kings and queens putting people to death, what that does is very easily communicate to the people who has control, which makes it very easy then for the people to say, oh, if I just overthrow these people in power, then everything will be good. Now, power doesn't really want that. Power wants to remain opaque. It wants to hide in the shadows and really creep in when it's most efficient, when it's most convenient for it. So biopolitics, exerts control not through force in a way that actually causes harm, but instead that directs people as specific populations. So it introduces new kinds of mapping and understanding, categorizing people in certain ways in order to clump them together to better know how to control them. Take advertising, for example. Advertising is targeted to you, specifically you as an individual. You receive your certain ad on your social media platform, but the only reason that that ad has actually arrived to you is because an algorithm, a certain kind of knowledge has been deployed that clumps you into a category that makes you susceptible or makes you appropriate for that ad. And in doing so, it shapes your wants, it shapes your needs, and drives you in a certain direction. It doesn't punish you, yet it is still a type of control. It puts you on a path that is not your own, yet makes you think that it is your own. I mean, you choose to click on the ad, you choose to buy this new thing, you choose to submit to this diet or whatever. Now, it's a very seductive idea. I mean, I think that Foucault is right about a lot of this. But along comes Mbembe, and he suggests that, well, how is this really possible? I mean, this type of system in which these individuals are allowed to flourish and liberalism is allowed to flourish. Well, really quite simply, it was permitted because of...
I think this is it, guys.
When the Martins booked their Verbo vacation home, they really weren't
slavery, of colonization, of economic exploitation of people all across the world that allowed certain parts of the world and certain people to enjoy the benefits of an economic system that ostensibly allowed them to be these free floating individuals existing for their own will or by their own will. So Mbembe suggests that instead of submitting to this idea of biopolitics as being this homogenous, all-encompassing idea to understand power relations today, we have to also leave room to understand that there is still rampant violence that goes on, mostly against people of color, people living in the third world, and that is specifically targeted in such a way as to maintain the privilege of certain people, notably white Europeans mostly. So rather than thinking about these old forms of power, as Foucault does, as disappearing and this new kind of power emerging, Mbembe instead identifies that sovereign power, sovereignty still very much exists today, and it is decided upon and it is determined by who gets to choose who gets to live and who gets to die, who gets to wage wars in countries in the Middle East, who gets to open up a new factory in Bangladesh and use it to economically exploit women and children there. So instead of thinking in this glossy way of power relations having transformed and become more benevolent, which is not something Foucault would say. He would say that it's become more efficient, it's become more pernicious in that way. Mbembe really wants to leave room for necropolitics to suggest that it's not just about life, extending life and controlling life. It is actually about very much as well ending life, certain life, especially down racial lines where some people can just die in order to uphold a norm, and certainly down gendered lines as well. If you look at any statistic, you know that gender-based violence occurs, like 94% of gender-based violence cases is men inflicting violence against women. And this happens all the time. And this is rampant violence that upholds a certain status quo, a hierarchical relation that is reminiscent of those of bygone eras of patriarchal control. We haven't moved into this new kind of purely efficient control. Instead, what we are seeing is old forms of control really sustain their old power in their exertion of force and violence in doing so, and then using that to keep themselves afloat, to sustain these power relations, to sustain these hierarchies. Now, these do so in order to create and maintain what he calls death worlds, zones in which people are just going to be at the constant threat of death. And we can really extend this as well all throughout the colonial regimes that Europe established all throughout Africa and Southeast Asia, really all across the world, that inflicted violence against millions of people. But yeah, it's important, I think, in my own opinion, to we can sympathize with Foucault. We can identify that we can really celebrate his observation that there is this new kind of control that emerged with the advent of liberalism, but that it doesn't mark a total departure from previous forms of control as they exerted themselves in terms of violence, especially how this violence is exerted against people of color all across the world. So we can, I think, really hold both to be true, both what Foucault says and Mbembe says. Really, this is what Mbembe says. He says that we have to maintain both. But I want to know what you think. Are you on a side? How do you actually reconcile these two perspectives? I would love to hear about it. If you like what I did, like, share, subscribe. I'll catch you next time. Take care.
So the politics of death and who can be killed by the state also lead one to think about crime and who can be considered to then be a criminal. So in the case of the murder of Cindy Gladue, Gladue was, as I said, referred to over and over in a court as a, quote, native prostitute. And Bradley Barton, who was accused of murdering Cindy Gladue, was not referred to as a white man. And these forms of categorization are really about crime and who committed crime and who is then culpable or guilty and who is innocent. So the refusal to kind of name white men as white men who have a long history of committing crimes against Indigenous women and girls is about then locating the kind of violence or understanding the case of Cindy Gladue, the murder of Cindy Gladue, as a case where it was the victim herself who committed crime, not the perpetrator. So if we were to use this term, say, white Canadian man, it would mean that Bradley Barton is just not kind of an unnamed person in history, but there is a specific genealogy of Canadian whiteness that is imbricated into the workings of nation building, and the building of a country that involved white, French, and British settlers colonizing Indigenous peoples. And the TRC reports and the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls reports document the ongoing what has been termed an ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples, and the naming of who commits crime or who is deemed to be suspect, morally and ethically suspect, and who is thought to be a criminal, are really at the heart of these questions of sovereignty, life, and death, and the idea of innocence and who is represented as being innocent in media, in film, in language, in a court of law is also about, is also kind of a question of race and racism. So the scripting of people of color and Indigenous people, Black people as being guilty, I think, or morally or ethically suspect is a common narrative. And constructing whiteness as innocent is also quite common, even from childhood onwards. We can look at European fairy tales and how innocence and goodness and morality and beauty come to be represented in European and Western media. So in Foucault's formulation of it, biopower appears to function through dividing people into those who must live and those who must die. Operating on the basis of a split between the living and the dead, such a power defines itself in relation to a biological field, which it takes control of and vests itself in. This control presupposes the distribution of human species into groups, the subdivision of the population to subgroups, and the establishment of a biological caesura between the ones and the others. This is what Foucault labels with the term, with the at first sight familiar term, racism. So this control of the population of who can and cannot have children, or whose is constructed to be an ideal person to have children by the state is part of many historical processes of slavery, of colonization. Savia Hartman is an academic who has written extensively about the relationship between the transatlantic slave trade and the politics of birth. And Hartman discusses all of the anxieties and the really deep-seated aggressions against Black women wanting to have children. But Hartman also discusses the kind of fanaticism that was also involved in Black women having children because of the politics of slavery. And these kind of poles of extreme discrimination and genocide, and then Black nationalism or ethno-nationalism are quite common, so that just having a child or not having a child takes on this whole kind of world of its own, and involves violence at the level of what Michel Foucault terms the species body. So Foucault discusses the way that women are often called upon to be a species body, and all of the aggressions and anxieties and kind of perverse desires and even, I guess, otherworldliness associated with the female body is perhaps because of this role of playing a species body who would give birth to certain religion or race or nation of people. The problem with this kind of fanaticism is that the kind of obsession with certain women giving birth corresponds to the desire to sterilize or kill women who would give birth to populations of people that are coded in certain ways as being part of a religious community or part of a majority or minority. The class action lawsuits that are going on now in Canada that focus on the sterilization of Indigenous women by nurses are an example of the kind of obscene forms of biopolitical violence, or what Mbembe calls necropolitics, that exist in Turtle Island. Referring to both this ever-presence and the phantom-like world of race in general, Arendt locates their roots in the shattering experience of otherness and suggests that the politics of race is ultimately linked to the politics of death. Indeed, in Foucault's terms, racism is above all a technology aimed at permitting the exercise of biopower, that old sovereign right of death. In the economy of biopower, the function of racism is to regulate the distribution of death and to make possible the murderous functions of the state. It is, he says, the condition for the acceptability of putting to death. So the politics of race is linked to the politics of death and who can live and who can die. So systemic racism is this technology aimed at permitting the valorization of certain lives and the annihilation or the threats to other lives. According to Foucault, the Nazi state was the most complete example of a state exercising the right to kill. The state, he claims, made the management, protection, and cultivation of life coextensive with the sovereign right to kill. By biological extrapolation on the theme of the political enemy and organizing the war against its adversaries, and at the same time exposing its own citizens to war, the Nazi state is seen as having opened the way for a formidable consolidation of the right to kill, which culminated in the project The Final Solution. In doing so, it became the archetype of a power formation that combined the characteristics of the racist state, the murderous state, and the suicidal state. It has been argued that the complete conflation of war and politics and racism, homicide, and suicide, until they are distinguishable from one another, is unique to the Nazi state. The perception of the existence of the other as an attempt on my life, as a mortal threat or absolute danger, whose biophysical elementation would strengthen my potential to life and security. This, I suggest, is one of the many imaginaries of sovereignty characteristic of both early and late modernity itself. Recognition of this perception to a large extent underpins most traditional critiques of modernity, whether they are dealing with nihilism and its proclamation of the will for power as the essence of being, with reification understood as the becoming object of the human being, of the subordination of everything to impersonal logic and to the reign of calculability and instrumental rationality. So Mbembe discusses then the politics of cruelty that are central to necropolitics. This kind of will to remove certain populations of people in order to build an ethnically or religiously pure nation obviously involves ongoing forms of cruelty, from minute kind of microaggressions or impoverishment of people to murder. In the relations between life and death, the politics of cruelty and the symbolics of profanity are blurred in the plantation system. It is notably in the colony and under the apartheid regime that there comes into being a peculiar terror formation. I will now turn to. Most original feature of this terror formation is its concatenation of biopower, the state of exception, the state of siege. Crucial to this concatenation is once again race. So Arendt develops the thesis that there is a link between nationalism, National Socialism, and traditional imperialism. According to her, the colonial conquest revealed a potential for violence previously unknown. What one witnesses in World War II was the extension to the civilized peoples of Europe of the methods previously reserved for the savages. That the technologies which ended up producing Nazism should have originated in the plantation or in the colony, or that on the contrary, Foucault's thesis, Nazism and Stalinism, did no more than amplify a series of mechanisms that already existed in Western European social and political formations, such as subjugation of the body, health regulation, social Darwinism, eugenics, medical legal theories on heredity, degeneration, and race, is in the end irrelevant. A fact, though, in modern philosophical thought and European political practice and imaginary, the colony represents the site where sovereignty consists fundamentally in the exercise of a power outside the law, where peace is more likely to take on the face of a war without end. So the article then discusses colonial occupation and war and the ways that sovereignty and the power to kill in order to create a certain vision of the nation has always been part of colonial occupations. And this is true of settler colonialism and really gruesome murders of Indigenous women and girls in settler Canada, and also the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports have documented the ways that education was also central to seizing Indigenous children from their parents and using institutions like the school system and the healthcare system to kill Indigenous people or to propagate trauma and mental health issues over generations. Colonial occupation itself was a matter of seizing, delimiting, and asserting control over a geographical area, of writing on the ground a new set of social and spatial relations. The writing of new spatial relations territorialization was ultimately tantamount to the production of boundaries and hierarchies, zones and enclaves, the subversion of existing property arrangements, the classification of people according to different categories, resource extraction, and finally, the manufacturing of a large reserve of cultural imaginaries. These imaginaries gave meaning to the enactment of different rights to different categories of people for different purposes within the same space, in brief, the exercise of sovereignty. Frans Fanon describes the spatialization of colonial occupation in vivid terms, and these are all quotes from the reading. And when I post them online, I'll make sure to put page numbers So these quotes about colonialism come near the end of the article. Mm. Around page 20. Let's see. Sorry about this. In the future lectures, I'll put the exact page numbers and when I give you the PPTs online, I will add the page numbers. I keep forgetting to do this. Apologies. But this is directly from the reading. So it's around page 20, when it's 26. So this quote is from page 26. So around page 20, Mbembe starts discussing colonialism. And so later on in the article, then the rest of the article then starts to discuss colonialism, slavery, the occupation of Palestine, and suicide bombing comes at the very end of the article. So Mbembe is then interested in this kind of politics of killing and the ways that killing is a form of necropolitics. And there are these techniques of necropower that are often about space, taking of people's homes or occupying land, and also the politics of reproduction are central to the building of the nation. And I would argue that the categorization of people because of skin color, race, religion, and name is obviously the most obvious and enduring form of necropower. So that using all of these techniques to construct distinct religious or ethnic or racial communities then allows one to valorize the success of certain populations, the birth of certain children as opposed to others. And we can see this in kind of all forms of ethnic conflict and ethnic cleansing. This is why the treatment of women who are deemed to be religious or racial minorities is often extremely violent or pathological or strange or sometimes perverse. So these actions constitute the politics of verticality. The resulting form of sovereignty might be called vertical sovereignty. Under a regime of vertical sovereignty, colonial occupation operates through schemes of over and underpasses, a separation of the airspace from the ground. The ground itself is divided between its crust and subterranean. Colonial occupation is also dictated by the very nature of the terrain and its topographical variations, hilltops and valleys, mountains and bodies of water. Thus, high ground offers strategic assets not found in the valleys, effectiveness of sight, self-protection, panoptic fortification that generates gazes to many different ends. So the politics of space are really central to colonialism, and command over physical space is a technique of necropower that allows one to seize land from groups of people and then impoverish them. And you can see this obviously in really grandiose ways in terms of colonization of actual countries, but you can also see this in housing disputes and the displacement of people who are poor or working class from certain neighborhoods and areas. The control over space is really about the power to make certain groups of people metaphorically homeless or actually homeless, and then to let these people died. So death in the present is the mediator of redemption. Far from being an encounter with a limit, a boundary or barrier, it is experienced as a release from terror and bondage. So Membe then talks about the politics of death in relation to histories of slavery and colonization. And the author draws on Paul Gilroy to discuss histories of slavery and also to discuss mass suicide. And this is why there are connections that Membe makes between the mass suicide of slaves and the suicide of people who are extremely poor and often persecuted because of religious violence or violence against religious minorities or violence against people who practice specific religions. So death is in the presence the mediator of redemption. Far from being an encounter with a limit, boundary, or barrier, it is experienced as a release from terror and bondage. As Gilroy notes, this preference for death over continued servitude is the commentary on the nature of freedom itself. If this lack is the very nature of what it means for the slave, the colonized, to exist, the same lack is also precisely the way in which he or she takes account of his or her mortality. Referring to the practice of individual or mass suicide by slaves cornered by the slave catchers, Gilroy suggests that death, in this case, can be represented as agency, for death is precisely that from and over which I have power. But it is also that space where freedom and negation operate. Death itself must become awareness of the self at the very time that it does away with the conscious being. In a sense, this is what happens, what at least is on the point of taking place, or what takes place in an elusive, fugitive manner, by means of a subterfuge in the sacrifice. In the sacrificed identifies himself with the animal on the point of death. Thus, he dies, seeing himself die, and even in some sense, through his own will, at one with the weapon of sacrifice. But this is play, and for Bataille, play is more or less the means by which the human subject voluntarily tricks himself.
Death appears to be a very private matter.
This is a clip about death and necropolitics.
To leave a like and subscribe. If you thought I got anything wrong or disagreed with anything, please let me know. Death appears to be a very private matter. In the public eye, few deaths are spoken about, saved almost entirely for celebrities and public figures. The loss of another is commonly left at the customary, "I'm sorry for your loss," and mourning for such a loss is expected to happen in private. In casual conversation, bringing up the topic of death is often seen as a cause for concern. For these reasons, death appears to be a very private matter, a topic hidden from our societal and political interests. But upon the inspection and analysis presented by Achille Mbembe, death turns out to be one of the most public matters of all, as death and the political or social power over it are found in each and every manifestation of government. In his 1976 work, The History of Sexuality, Michel Foucault established the concept of biopower, a new form of social and political control that modern forms of government can enact on populations. Rather than an old governmental right to execute, biopower represents the newfound power of governments to administer life. Through medicine, statistics, bureaucracy, and much, much more, biopower and its two poles of discipline and regulation have led to increases in life expectancy, decreases in mortality rates, and improvements in the general standard of living. Put simply, modern governments may now decide who is being taken care of by the benevolent, surveillance-driven governmentality of advanced democracies. But this implies a choice by the modern government. Some populations are chosen to be given life, and others are not. This choice reveals the inherent racism of biopower. Not necessarily racism in the sense one may commonly encounter it today, but in a broader sense, suggesting that as some populations are chosen to receive life, others are not. This can be drawn along a variety of lines: ethnicity, class, gender, cultural, and more. But in each case, an inequality exists, whereby one group receives greater care than another. This choice for who is to be made to live occurs along the axes of value and utility. For Foucault, this biopower arose around the 17th and 18th century, usurping a far older form of power, that of death. And in this gradual overthrow, biopower hid its converse. For the populations that are administered life, death has intentionally become taboo. In another work, Society Must Be Defended, Foucault wrote that it is now not so much sex as death that is the object of taboo, and continues, it is only natural that death should now be privatized and should become the most private thing of all. My introduction suggested this, and acknowledged the way in which death has been moved out of the public eye.
Well, I'll stop there, and when I post the slides online, you'll have access to the full clip. In the interest of time, I'll move on just to talk about this concept of death worlds and suicide that Achille Mbembe writes about in this article. I've put forward the notion of necropolitics and necropower to account for the ways in which, in our contemporary world, weapons are deployed in the interest of maximum destructions of persons and the creation of death worlds, new and unique forms of social existence, in which vast populations are subject to conditions of life conferring upon them the status of living dead. So the treatment of refugees is something that comes to mind when one reads this article, and also the politics of war. The essay has also outlined some of the repressed topographies of cruelty, the plantation and colony in particular, and has suggested that under conditions of necropower, the lines between resistance and suicide, sacrifice and redemption, martyrdom and freedom are blurred. So I'll finish this with this quote from Achille Mbembe, and Professor Mbembe is a Cameroonian historian, political theorist, and public intellectual who is research professor in history and politics at the Wits Institute for Social and Economy Research at the University of the Witwatersrand. He is well known for his writings on colonialism and its consequences, and is a leading figure in New Wave French critical theory. And so he is currently a member of the staff at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Witwatersrand, which is in Johannesburg, South Africa, and has an annual visiting appointment at the Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University in the United States of America. So he's also contributing editor to the scholarly journal Public Culture. So hopefully you found the article interesting, and you might want to consider thinking about this topic, an essay for your presentation or for further assignments. So I'll finish with this quote: the ultimate expression of sovereignty largely resides in the power and capacity to dictate who is able to live and who must die. To kill or to let live thus constitutes sovereignty's limits, its principal attributes. To be sovereign is to exert one's control over mortality, to define life as the deployment and manifestation of power. So that is all. And so this week's lectures have looked at biopower, biopolitics, necropower, and necropolitics, and specific questions that I think that the lectures raise, or that I hope that can be considered, are about sovereign power, and to what extent sovereign power has the right to invest in certain lives and to divest in others. Thank you.